principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. I've been saying that for years, and people nod and they agree, but I don't think they really get it. They think I'm talking about other people. They think, yes, those other people fool themselves, but not me. I'm careful. I'm rational. I'm a scientist. And that's exactly the problem. The smarter you are, the better you are at fooling yourself. Because intelligence isn't just about solving problems. It's about constructing elaborate justifications for what you already want to believe. Let me tell you how I know this. I've spent my whole life around smart people. Really smart people. Nobel Prize winners. Brilliant mathematicians. Physicists who can do calculations in their heads that would take most people hours with a calculator. And you know what? They fool themselves all the time. Maybe more than average people, because they're so good at making their self-deception sound reasonable. Let me start with a story. During World War II, the Americans had air bases on islands in the Pacific. The islanders would see planes landing, cargo being unloaded, all these amazing goods arriving from the sky. Then the war ended and the planes stopped coming. So what did the islanders do? They built fake runways out of bamboo. They carved headphones out of wood and wore them. They waved landing signals at the empty sky. They were imitating all the surface features of an airport, hoping it would bring the planes back. That's cargo cult behavior. They had the form, but not the substance. And it didn't work, because planes don't care about bamboo runways. Now you might laugh at that. You might think, how naive, how simple-minded. But here's the thing. Scientists do this all the time. I call it cargo cult science. You go to a scientific conference and you see all the trappings of science. People in lab coats, complicated equipment, statistical analyses, peer-reviewed papers. It looks like science. It sounds like science. But something's missing. The planes aren't landing. What's missing is a kind of scientific integrity, a principle of scientific thought that corresponds to a kind of utter honesty. You bend over backwards to show how you might be wrong. You give all the information that someone else would need to judge your work. You don't just give the information that supports your conclusion. But people don't do that. Smart people especially don't do that, because they're too invested in being right. Here's what happens. You're a smart person. You come up with a theory, or you believe something, or you've invested time and reputation in an idea. Then evidence comes along that contradicts it. A less intelligent person might just ignore the evidence. They might not even understand it. But you're smart. So you do something more sophisticated. You explain it away. And because you're intelligent, your explanation sounds good. It's logical. It's internally consistent. You can defend it in an argument. You can convince other people. And most importantly, you can convince yourself. I saw this at Los Alamos when we were building the atomic bomb. We had all these brilliant people, really the best minds in physics, and we'd have arguments about calculations, about how the bomb would work, about how much uranium we'd need, and I noticed something. When someone made an error in a calculation, if that error supported what they already believed, they'd miss it. But if the error went against what they believed, they'd spot it immediately. Same person, same level of intelligence, but selective attention based on what they wanted to be true. That's fooling yourself. And the scary part is, it's unconscious. They weren't deliberately cheating. They genuinely didn't see their own errors. Their brain just skipped over them. Here's another way smart people fool themselves. They trust authority when they shouldn't. You'd think smart people would be skeptical, right? You'd think they'd question things, demand evidence, think for themselves. And they do, up to a point. But then they hit something that's outside their expertise, and suddenly they become credulous. I'll give you an example. I knew physicists, brilliant physicists, who wouldn't question a mathematical proof for a second. They'd check every step, demand rigor, spot errors, but then they'd read something in the newspaper about medicine or economics or politics, and they'd just accept it. No skepticism at all. Why? Because it was outside their domain, and they assumed that the experts in that other field were as careful and rigorous as they were in physics. But that's not always true, and even when it is true, experts can be wrong. The smartest thing you can say is, I don't know. But smart people hate saying that. They're used to being the person with answers. So instead, they defer to whoever sounds authoritative. And that's how you get fooled. I saw this during the Challenger investigation. All these smart engineers, smart managers, smart NASA officials, and they all knew, deep down, that the O-rings were a problem. They had data showing the O-rings got brittle in cold temperatures. They had engineers saying, don't launch in the cold. But the pressure was on, the schedule, the budget, the politics. And so these smart people convinced themselves it would probably be okay. They looked at the data in a way that supported what they wanted to believe. They trusted the authority figures who said to launch. And 7 people died. That's not stupidity. That's intelligence being used to fool yourself. Here's another thing about smart people. They're really good at seeing patterns. That's part of what makes them smart. They can look at data and see relationships, connections, underlying structures. But here's the problem. The human brain is too good at seeing patterns. It sees patterns even when they're not there. It sees faces in clouds. It sees conspiracy in coincidence. It sees meaning in randomness. And smart people are even more susceptible to this because they're better at constructing elaborate narratives to explain the patterns they think they see. I'll give you an example. I knew a brilliant physicist once who became convinced that there was a pattern in the distribution of prime numbers that nobody else had noticed. He spent months working on it. He had notebooks full of calculations. He gave seminars about it. And it was complete nonsense. There was no pattern. He was seeing structure in noise. But because he was smart, he could construct very sophisticated arguments for why his pattern was real. He could respond to every objection. He could explain away every contradiction. It took him a long time to realize he'd been fooling himself. And even then, I'm not sure he fully accepted it, because he'd invested so much in the idea, and he'd gotten so good at defending it. That's another way smart people fool themselves, the sunk cost fallacy. You've invested time, energy, reputation in an idea. Maybe you've published papers about it. Maybe you've built a career on it. And then evidence comes along that it might be wrong. The rational thing to do is update your beliefs based on the new evidence. But that's hard, because it means admitting you were wrong. It means all that time and effort was wasted. It means looking foolish. So instead, you double down. You find ways to explain away the contradictory evidence. You attack the methodology of studies that disagree with you. You surround yourself with people who agree with you and avoid people who don't. And because you're smart, you can make this all sound very reasonable. You can construct elaborate justifications for why you're not changing your mind. You can claim you're being appropriately skeptical, that you're maintaining intellectual consistency, that you're resisting fashionable but misguided new ideas. But really, you're just fooling yourself. I've seen this in physics. People who develop a theory and then spend decades defending it, even as the evidence mounts against it. They're too smart to just ignore the evidence, so they get creative with their explanations. They add epicycles to their epicycles. And the tragedy is, these are genuinely brilliant people. If they could just let go of their attachment to being right, if they could just admit, I was wrong, let's start over, they could do amazing work. But they can't. They fooled themselves too thoroughly. Psychologists have a term for this, motivated reasoning. It's when you use your intelligence not to find the truth, but to defend what you already believe. And the smarter you are, the better you are at it. Here's how it works. Someone presents you with evidence that contradicts what you believe. If you weren't smart, you might just reject it emotionally. I don't like that, so it's wrong. But you're smart. So instead, you analyze the evidence critically. You look for flaws in the methodology. You question the assumptions. You demand rigorous standards of proof. And here's the trick. You only do this for evidence that contradicts your beliefs. Evidence that supports your beliefs, you accept it uncritically. You don't look for flaws. You don't question assumptions. So you end up with this asymmetry. You have a high bar for evidence you don't like and a low bar for evidence you do like. And you convince yourself that you're being rational because you can articulate reasons for accepting some evidence and rejecting other evidence. But those reasons are post hoc rationalizations. You're not following the evidence to a conclusion. You're starting with the conclusion and working backwards. I catch myself doing this all the time. I'll read a paper that disagrees with my ideas, and I'll immediately start looking for problems with it. Then I'll read a paper that agrees with me, and I'll think, yes, exactly, good work. The only defense is to know you do this, to watch yourself doing it, to catch yourself in the act and say, wait, am I being consistent here? Would I accept this same argument if it led to a conclusion I didn't like? Here's another way smart people fool themselves. They think they understand things they don't actually understand. There's this phenomenon psychologists call the illusion of explanatory depth. You think you know how something works, But if someone asks you to explain it in detail, you realize you don't. Smart people are especially prone to this because they're good at holding complex ideas in their heads. They can talk about quantum mechanics or evolution or economics using all the right terminology. They sound like they understand. But terminology isn't understanding. Knowing the name of something is not the same as knowing something. I learned that from my father when I was a kid, and it stuck with me my whole life. Let me give you a test. Can you explain how a bicycle stays upright? Not just angular momentum or gyroscopic effect. Actually explain the mechanism. Draw a diagram. Show me the forces. Most people can't. Even smart people. Even physicists. They think they understand bicycles because they can ride them and they've heard the terms. But they don't actually understand the dynamics. And here's the thing. If you can't explain something simply, in detail, from first principles, then you don't understand it. You just think you do. But it's easy to fool yourself, especially if you're smart, because you can string together the right words in the right order, and it sounds like understanding. You can convince other people, and more importantly, you can convince yourself. Confirmation bias is the tendency to notice and remember information that confirms what you already believe, and to ignore or forget information that contradicts it. Everyone does this, but smart people do it in more sophisticated ways. A less intelligent person might just selectively read news sources that agree with them. But a smart person, they'll read everything. They'll engage with opposing viewpoints. They'll pride themselves on being open-minded. But then, subtly, unconsciously, they'll give more weight to the arguments they already agreed with. They'll remember the flaws in the arguments against their position more clearly than the flaws in the arguments for it. They'll find sophisticated reasons to discount the evidence that contradicts them. And because they're engaging with both sides, because they're reading widely, because they're thinking critically, they believe they're being objective. They don't realize the scales are tilted. I saw this all the time in debates about physics. Two smart people, both looking at the same data, reaching opposite conclusions, and each one convinced that the other is being irrational, that they're the one being objective. Sometimes they're both fooling themselves. They've both got confirmation bias, just pointing in opposite directions. The only solution is to actively work against your own biases, to try to prove yourself wrong instead of trying to prove yourself right, to seek out the strongest arguments against your position and really engage with them, not just to dismiss them. But that's hard. It goes against every instinct, and most people, even smart people, don't do it. There's this famous effect where incompetent people overestimate their abilities because they're too incompetent to recognize their incompetence. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect. But there's a flip side that I've noticed. Really smart people sometimes underestimate how hard things are for other people because they forget what it's like not to know something. And this leads to a weird kind of self-deception. They think, if it's obvious to me, it must be obvious to everyone. So when someone disagrees with them, they assume the person must be stupid or dishonest. They can't imagine that an intelligent, honest person could look at the same evidence and reach a different conclusion. This is a kind of fooling yourself, because you're overestimating the objectivity of your own perspective. You're assuming that your way of seeing things is the only reasonable way. I've been guilty of this. I've explained something in physics and thought, this is so clear, how could anyone not get it? And then I realize it's only clear to me because I've spent decades thinking about it. To someone else, with different background knowledge, different intuitions, it's not clear at all. Recognizing this is important. Because if you assume everyone who disagrees with you is foolish or dishonest, you'll never learn anything from them. You'll just reinforce your own views in an echo chamber of your own making. Here's a paradox. The more often you're right, the more likely you are to fool yourself. Why? Because success breeds confidence. And confidence makes you less likely to question yourself. If you've been right about things in the past, if your predictions have come true, if your theories have been validated, you start to trust your intuition. You start to think, I'm good at this. My instincts are reliable. And maybe they are, in your domain of expertise. But then you venture outside that domain, and you still have that same confidence. You still trust your gut. But now your gut is unreliable, because you don't have the experience and expertise to calibrate it. I've seen this with successful physicists who think they can solve problems in biology or economics or politics with the same ease they solve physics problems. And they can't. Because those fields are different. The methods that work in physics don't always transfer, but they're used to being right. They're used to their ideas working. So when they encounter resistance, when experts in the other field tell them it's more complicated than that, they assume the experts are being unnecessarily obscure. They assume they're seeing clearly what others are missing. Sometimes that's true. Fresh perspectives can be valuable, but often it's just the Dunning-Kruger effect, wearing a clever disguise. So how do we defend against all this? How do we avoid fooling ourselves? The answer is, we can't. Not completely. Self-deception is part of being human, and being smart doesn't make you immune. If anything, it makes you better at it. But we can build systems that make it harder to fool ourselves. That's what the scientific method is, really. It's a system designed to compensate for human fallibility. Peer review means other people check your work. Replication means other people have to be able to get the same results. Public data means people can verify your claims. Pre-registration means you can't change your hypothesis after you've seen the results. All of these are defenses against self-deception, against motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, pattern finding in noise, all of it. But here's the thing. You have to actually follow these practices. You have to genuinely invite criticism. You have to actually try to prove yourself wrong. You can't just go through the motions. And that's where cargo cult science comes in again. People doing all the surface things, having peer review and statistics and fancy equipment, but not actually trying to find the truth, just trying to publish papers, just trying to be right. Real science requires a kind of humility. It requires admitting that you might be wrong, that you probably are wrong about something, that your intelligence is just as likely to lead you astray as to lead you toward truth, unless you're very, very careful. Let me tell you what I do, how I try to avoid fooling myself. First, I try to really understand opposing viewpoints, not strawman versions, the strongest possible versions. I try to state them so well that someone who holds that view would say, yes, exactly, that's what I believe. Only then do I try to evaluate them. Because if I can't even state the opposing view accurately, how can I possibly judge whether it's wrong? Second, I look for evidence that would prove me wrong, not evidence that would prove me right. I already believe I'm right. That's the problem. I need to test that belief. What would convince me I'm wrong? If I can't answer that question, I'm not doing science. I'm just defending a position. Third, I try to catch myself making excuses. When I find myself explaining away evidence I don't like, I stop. I pay attention to that. I ask myself, am I being consistent? Would I accept this excuse if someone else made it to defend a position I disagree with? Fourth, I'm honest about uncertainty. If I don't know something, I say so. If something is a guess, I label it as a guess. I don't pretend to have more certainty than I actually have. And fifth, I remember, I'm smart enough to know that I'm dumb. That's not false modesty. That's recognition that intelligence is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used well or poorly. It can build or it can destroy. It can reveal truth or construct elaborate lies. The same brain that lets me solve quantum mechanics problems can convince me of complete nonsense if I'm not careful. In fact, it's better at convincing me of nonsense because I trust it. So here's what it comes down to. The ultimate defense against fooling yourself is honesty. Brutal, uncomfortable, ego-destroying honesty. You have to be willing to look at your own thinking and say, that's a rationalization. You have to be willing to admit, I believe that because I want it to be true, not because the evidence supports it. You have to be willing to say I was wrong. And that's hard, especially for smart people, because we're used to being right. We're used to our intelligence solving problems. Admitting we've been fooling ourselves feels like admitting our intelligence failed us. But that's backwards. The failure isn't in admitting you were wrong. The failure is in not admitting it, in continuing to fool yourself, in using your intelligence to defend falsehoods instead of discover truths. I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. That's not just a nice saying. That's a life philosophy. It's a defense against self-deception. Because when you cling to answers, when you defend them against all evidence, when you can't question them, that's when you know you've fooled yourself. The universe doesn't care about your ego. It doesn't care if you're smart. It doesn't care if you've invested years in an idea. It just is what it is. And your job, as someone trying to understand it, is to be honest about what you see, even when it contradicts what you want to see, especially when it contradicts what you want to see. So that's my message. You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Being smart doesn't protect you from this. If anything, it makes it worse. because you're better at constructing rationalizations. You're better at defending bad ideas. You're better at motivated reasoning. The only defense is vigilance. Constant, exhausting vigilance against your own biases, against your own desire to be right, against your own tendency to see what you want to see and ignore what you don't. It's hard work. It's uncomfortable. It goes against every instinct, but it's the only way to actually understand anything. The only way to get closer to truth instead of further from it. So be skeptical, especially of your own ideas, especially of the ideas you're most confident about, especially of the ideas you've invested the most in. Question everything, including and especially yourself, because the first principle is that you must not fool yourself.